Even with Netflix having recently proven a live-action adaptation of a superpower-focused manga can work, I expected their attempt at Yu Yu Hakusho to at best be a bunch of people doing lukewarm cosplays and missing the meaning of the original work. On that level, it exceeded my expectations, but is that to say it's good for what it is? Well, let's get into it. The biggest strength of this version as a reworking of Yu Yu Hakusho is its concise pacing and interconnected narrative. Perhaps the most overarching issue of the original is how a huge amount of plot points and side characters end up amounting to nothing in terms of advancing the main plot, or Team Urameshi, beyond adding to the latter's win-loss record. Even the recurring ones from the Ankoku Bujutsukai, whose roles aside from Suzuki, whose main addition was power-ups for Kurama and Kuwabara, amounted to being just a means for Kurama to get more status in Yomi's group, through inexplicable training gains I might add, and then being fodder for Raizen's friends. Cutting ranting about them short though. The changes made in the Netflix version show how much could be cut from the original for the better, with more planning than Jump's work schedule would have allowed Togashi when creating the series. This can also be said with how seamlessly the various plot points and character motivations connect into the climax, to an extent far greater than the events of the original Spirit Detective arc, where the mini-arcs within it are connected fairly loosely. Yusuke goes to be accepted as Genkai's student under Koenma's instruction after having defeated Hiei in the manga, whereas he has more incentive to be tutored by Genkai in the Netflix version when outclassed by Hiei's speed, and the events of episode 1 providing Kuwabara extra incentive to tag along. On the subject of Hiei, his integration into the group is also handled smoother, with his motivation of saving Yukina playing into his stealing of the Conjuring Blade being more consistent with its role in awakening the Jagan, whereas its original equivalent that turns people into yokai makes no sense with his later established motivation, nor does his one-dimensional evil attitude in his battle with Yusuke line up with his later characterization, which the Netflix version fixed wonderfully, along with making it more understandable why Yusuke would be willing to team up with Hiei than in the manga. With Togashi having had some hand in the Netflix version, I wouldn't be surprised if one or many of these cuts and changes were what he personally approved, with him being someone who can be openly critical about his work and interested in refining prior themes or character archetypes, such as in his later works. On the flip side, there are many cuts that made some of the standout characters in the original fairly watered down, namely Genkai, Sakyo, and especially Toguro. Although the cut-in of Rando was for the best, a piece of dialogue that could have easily been placed in a different context from the tournament Genkai held shows her as more morally neutral than the standard Old Master archetype, in much the same way Togashi would have Netero take that to another level. The lack of it causes her Netflix self to be a generic Old Master archetype with nothing beyond the norm. Sakyo stands out in both versions as someone who uses charisma and money to manipulate the plot around him rather than physical might, but the lack of conflict with his peers and need to rise up the ranks due to his background makes his chaotic gambles in this version the sole character trait carrying him, which, while working for the series, makes him a hollow copy of his original self. Finally, there's younger Toguro, someone I'd confidently cite as the best character in the manga, let alone best villain, and unlike one such as Sensui, not one to have been given a more refined equivalent in Togashi's later work. Though Netflix's Toguro captures his general role and implements his backstory a lot smoother than the anime and manga reserving it until after he died did, the lack of nuances leading up to the reveal of this more complex, colourful, strength-driven individual, such as his apology for killing Helen or his unexpected taste in drinks, looks make him at best a serviceable dark parallel to Yusuke, and at worst purely a reflection of Yusuke for him to surpass. Speaking of Yusuke, it's worth going over Team Urameshi. Yusuke's portrayal gets the major parts of his character as a misunderstood delinquent right, but his brash nature and humour being toned down does make him the diet version of his character. Leaving aside Kuwabara being one of the biggest departures from the original design, with Hiei somehow having more of a pompadour, this version improves several aspects of him, such as his training and motivation to surpass Yusuke awakening his Reiken, allowing him to be taken more seriously as a rival, and fortunately doesn't have anything as immersion breaking as getting a huge love-induced power-up, but has the trade-off of his softer side being toned down, such as his kitten Eikichi's removal. Kurama's character is very faithful to the manga, and his ability to use his Yoko form at will is a great case of streamlining, with this becoming the case after his battle with Karasu in the manga anyway. The most criticism I can give is that cutting of characters such as Roto cuts tests to Kurama's strength of character, but I take this as a necessary loss, if it otherwise necessitated characters that don't add much to the story. As mentioned before, Netflix Hiei is a vast improvement on the consistency of his early character arc, and executes his more iconic personality flawlessly, though the same can't be said of his dual hair colours. On that note, there's then the aesthetics. The effort in being authentic to the anime is a mixed bag. Kuwabara and Hiei's looks miss the mark in a few ways, as already mentioned, but the other characters are faithful to the appearance of their anime selves, including the CGI on characters such as Gorky being fairly okay, as is Togoro's full power state in capturing the mutated nature of his yokai self, and the humanity still at its core, even if the superior manga design couldn't be replicated fully. One CGI element I find works really well is the portrayal of the Reikai, which is both wider and more ethereal than what glimpses we get in the original series, though seems to be far less lived in, with only Koenma and Botan ever being present. Perhaps the biggest standout in capturing both the look and mannerisms of the original though is in Elder Toguro, embodying the general appearance, body movements, and sadistic attitude he should. I'd also give some praise to Kaji Meiko being cast as Genkai, as a once beautiful star of action flicks still carrying a great energy to her performance, while acknowledging the necessity of time's passing. Couldn't be a more perfect fit to play Genkai, unless maybe she was also a secret gamer too. After going over the major aspects of this series, it's probably worth focusing on some episode-specific points. The idea of creating a new yokai to be Yusuke's first challenge after revival works well for the plot, but is probably the weakest plot thread in the season. Yusuke's path to revival is simpler than the original, but works well when attempting to condense the plot. One omission that raises questions in Koenma's introduction is that of Enma's current role or location, whereas the original established Koenma to fill in on less important matters or when his father is away. The Netflix version treats Enma as barely existent. That may imply they decided to have the senior Enma already be retired or passed on for simplicity, but some elaboration wouldn't hurt. Episode 2 retroactively improves on an issue that the manga's more bloated cast and power creep created later on, in it making little sense how the Reikai's security was so bad D-class yokai could steal valuable items. That's not been the case here, with the Team Toguro members being only traitors one step above the thief trio, allows for the likes of Gorky to be seen more as a genuine threat than the pecking order of the manga would suggest. Yes, there was an attempted explanation for this later on, but to say it was half-baked would be putting it lightly. Not much more to say on that other than things being very streamlined in terms of Kuwabara's awareness of the spirit detective situation, and his attempt to stop Yusuke risking his newly restored life both being good, despite offering improvements to Hiei's character I mentioned before, as well as bringing Keiko into the events of the plot without the need for a tedious mini-arc. Episode 3 also has one of the biggest missteps in the series, with Genkai's transference of the Reiko Gyoku to Yusuke offering him an instant power-up, being lazy compared compared to the original Yusuke having to endure intense pain from this, and the power-up afterwards being a reward for his determination, reducing one of the better cases in the series of a quick power-up as a trial to simply being an instant XP boost. Episode 4 is the major set of battles before Toguro, and does this fairly well, including some decent comedy in the scenes involving Kuwabara. I prefer Karasu not turning into a bargain bin Super Saiyan when not wearing his mask, as his black hair design was more iconic anyway. The decision to have Koenma hide Genkai's death from Yusuke as opposed to the latter witnessing it and hiding it from Kuwabara works here, though I wouldn't say it's better or worse than the original. Episode 5 for the most part replicates Yusuke vs Toguro well enough, and the implementation of Toguro's backstory is handled better here as already mentioned. The fleeing billionaires does become a loose end though, and less impactful than Sakyo setting things up for Tarukane and his ilk to be taken out, but it's otherwise okay in capturing the same beats for the action segments as Togashi's work, following the manga by having Genkai not be revived at the end, and, if at all, saved for the Black Chapter arc, unlike the anime offering it too early, was a better move for this season, as her revival in general raises a lot of questions as to how important death is in the series with Koenma around. Toguro's line on Yusuke's potential, as well as his brother's post-credit gag appearance, hint at the other two major arcs being adapted in the future, which would be a welcome addition, if only to fix the potentially interesting but poorly executed Three Kins arc. With all that said though, Netflix's Yu Yu Hakusho doesn't stand on its own as well as the live-action One Piece does. What it does better than that though is in what necessary changes it made in streamlining the plot. Though I've praised the choices that version of One Piece made, what flaws it fixed were fairly minor ones that don't necessarily warrant its existence, as more than a statement to such adaptations, or introduction to the series for those that have an aversion to manga for some reason. This Yu Yu Hakusho, meanwhile, seeks to fix some of the issues of the original work, and does so through excellent streamlining of the story, and seamlessly bringing its plot points together. Comparing it to the original is a mixed bag, with the lost character nuances mentioned, that could have been fixed with an extra episode or added runtime, but the intent behind it is what any remake regardless of the medium should aim to do: improve on issues of the original in order to justify the reimagining's existence. Because of this, I'm surprised to say I look forward to getting more of this series in the future, even if out of curiosity on its handling, rather than genuinely finding it a good quality work. Thank you if having watched through my analysis and comparison. I won't say I plan on doing more videos focused on Yu Yu Hakusho, but if there's a demand for analyses on it or Togashi's current work, I'd have a few ideas in mind. If here more for the topic of live-action manga adaptations though, perhaps you'd be interested in a similar video on Netflix's One Piece.